Now, let's try to take a closer look at the first concept here, ontology. And I would also say when we start talking about these, there might be words where you think, yes, I do not understand this, but just hang on and follow, because then we'll do some small exercises and then it will become more clear what it is. So ontology, the idea about ontology, when we simply just look into it, it is learning about what exists. And it's also about assumptions about the object of observation. Now, let us imagine for a moment that we are investigating something. Then that object or that thing we are investigating would become the object. So if we look at how is the motivation in a company, for example, then motivation will be our object. Or if we are investigating something about rainforests, then the rainforests would be our object of observation. And then combining that with the idea about learning about what exists, then looking at a rainforest, does that exist? Yes, probably, most likely. What about motivation? Does that exist? Yes. But those two things are quite different in the way they are and the way they exist. So therefore, when we are talking about ontology, it's a simple question about how do we look upon this? What kind of assumptions do we have about what we are observing? And as VCM people, we do observe a lot of things. We observe production, we observe how people work, etc. So there are reasons for us to reflect upon what is it that we are looking at, and how do we know that it exists in the way we believe? So let's try to take it a bit further. So what is reality, and what exists exactly? And therefore, what is existence? These are, you might say, quite heavy questions, and of course I agree, because how do we think about this? And that is where I would like to try and make it really simple and understandable, because there are basically two simple approaches to understand existence. And please note that I'm making this more simple than it really is, but it's a really good way to get started. So one way to understand how something exists is that we can look upon it as something that is given to us by nature. So if something is nature given, that is one way this thing, this object, might exist. And at the other hand, if something is given to us by culture, then that's another way to understand why something exists. And therefore, when we look at ontology, it might be so simple to simply ask a question: is this thing that we are observing, this thing that we are looking at, is that something that is nature given, or is it culture given? And when it is culture given, from a theory of science perspective, we also call it subjectivism. And when it is nature given, we are almost over in this objectivism perspective. So now we are talking about paradigms, but we will get back to that part as well. So just try to hang on to the idea that objects that we are looking upon, they can be given to us by nature, or they can be given to us by culture. And culture is, of course, people. We create culture. Humans create culture. And you do know that we have national culture. We have different kinds of culture in different companies. So when we are talking about culture, it's about something we as humans have created in some way or another. So first, now a little assignment about ontology. I would like you to solve this little assignment here. And the assignment simply is that we have some objects, and therefore I'm going to present you with a couple of objects here. And then your job is to look at these objects that approaches here, and then discuss, is this object nature given or is it culture given? So it's really not more than this. And therefore, you would have to simply go in and discuss those words. And in doing that, I'm going to put you into some breakout rooms where you have just a couple of minutes to discuss, are these objects nature given or are they culture given? Let's take a look at them. We have the objects: money, rainforest, vampires, gravity, and supply chains. So these are the objects that you're going to discuss. And then if you could take a picture with your phone or something else, just to make sure that you have those objects when I put you into breakout rooms, it would be fine. And you are going to have 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'll call you back and ask a couple of you what you think about these objects. Good. So now we found out that we have some different ways of looking upon objects. And the next thing that we would look into is what we call epistemology. But before we do that, let's just say ontology, it's about assumptions about the object that we observe. And here we have observed money, rainforest, vampires, gravity, and supply chains. Now, that idea about them being nature given or cultural given, these are our assumptions. Now let's try to look into something that we would say, how do we then recognize reality? And putting it more straight, we could say, how do we know what we know? And that might sound like quite a philosophical question, but it is pretty simple when we start to look at it. Because, for example, do we use our senses to understand something? Do we have text? Do we use our eyes? Do we read? Do we try to put things into a context? Do we have a positive or negative attitude towards something that would be based on our feelings, etc.? So are these the ways we use our senses to understand reality? Is this how we understand a supply chain, for example? Is this how we understand vampires? So these are the questions. And then, do we maybe use reason and rationality in order to understand what we know? So if we use reason and rationality, do we look into facts, for example? Do we use facts about vampires to understand what vampires are? And if we do that, if we try to look upon facts and observable phenomena and general ideas and laws regarding how vampires are, and we do that with reason and rationality, then we will probably find that vampires does not exist. So when we are looking into how do we know what we know, then reflecting upon how do we know what we know about vampires, then we would probably have to conclude that, well, we know that based on our attitudes. We know that because of written texts. We have maybe been listening to stories or tried to imagine things. It's not that we have actually seeing someone bite another person in the neck and suck blood out of that particular person. So understanding epistemology is more or less just about how do we know what we know, and asking these two questions. How do we know what we know? By, well, using our senses to understand, or do we use our reason and rationality to understand? So I'm going to give you a little exercise again, just to get good started here. So how do we recognize something that is cultural given? And Santa during Christmas is also a cultural given thing. And how do we recognize something that is nature given, like mountains? Do we use senses to understand, attitudes, written text, etc.? Or do we use reason and rationality? Now, this little exercise, we'll just keep quiet for half a minute and then just think about it, where you are, and then we will proceed from here. Okay, let's proceed. And I'm pretty sure that all of you are quite comfortable saying that when we are talking about something that is cultural given, then we do use our senses to understand. And when we are talking about mountains, well, most of us would probably, in order to understand mountains, we would rely on facts. We could measure the mountain. We could figure out how high is it, how wide is it. We would look at how it seems, and we would observe that object, and we would try to generate general ideas about, well, when something looks like this, we would call it a mountain, and it is characterized by this and this. So when we have the idea about how to recognize something, again, it's a little different how we do it, depending on whether it's cultural given or nature given. So these were the two first parts of what we talk about in theory of science, namely ontology and epistemology. And then we get to the part called methodology. And this is also quite interesting, because this is where we start to get more ideas about how to collect data, etc. So let's try to look at what methodology is. And methodology is about learning about procedure. It's about specific ways to collect data. So if we try to think back right now, ontology is about how do we see reality. And epistemology is about asking ourselves, how do we know what we know? Then methodology is the third step, saying this is how we actually collect data, and specific ways to collect data. And we always use data in order to understand the object that we are observing. If it was a supply chain, we would collect data in a specific way. If it was motivation in a company, there's a specific way to collect these type of data. So let's try to take a closer look at methodology here. And again, I'm trying to connect to epistemology here, because do we use our senses to understand? That was the idea of us trying to have data that would tell us about phenomenons. And we call those data that we collect in connection with our senses for qualitative data. That means that they are characterized by they cannot objectively be measured. And we may not be able to put a weight on them. We may not be able to count it, but we do get understanding. We do get depth, but we can seldom generalize. So if we want to understand what motivates another person, then we cannot really measure or weigh that motivation, but we can get understanding of what that person is talking about when that person is expressing, well, I get motivated by doing things, or I get motivated when I get some rewards, for example. Then we get that understanding, but we cannot necessarily generalize and say, well, because one person says this, then all people in the whole world is going to be motivated in the same way. So methodology is also about understanding, what about qualitative data? Can we use those, and what kind of qualitative data do we have that would help us to understand what we see? Then we have the next one, which is about rationality, which is also what we just talked about. And that leads to what we call quantitative data. Data that can be measured, data that can be weighed or counted. And in some way, we can generalize from data. Very often, we also say that quantitative data is something that we can measure and weight and count. That's the very simple way to understand it. But it's even easier to understand the differences here if we try to do it ourselves. And therefore, let's try to do an exercise here where we will be in breakout rooms. The exercise is, how can we find average age for students at the VCM third semester? And what is the average height for students at the VCM third semester? Now, what I want you to do is, in the breakout rooms, that you have to figure out what is the object that we investigate. And for the first one here, that would be average age. That is the object. Okay, for that object, average age, will we go for quantitative or qualitative data? And when you have decided what kind of data you would go for, would you go for, or how would you collect these data? And when you have decided how you would collect it, then how can we treat those data, or how can we analyze those data? So you have to do that for average age, because that is the object that we are investigating. What about average height? Same thing, object. Will we go for qualitative or quantitative? How can we collect data about average height? And how can we analyze these data? Now, before I put you into breakout rooms, do you understand the assignment? And by that, I mean, are there anyone who is having doubts about what to do in the breakout room? Now,
this meeting is being recorded.
Regarding this question here, this exercise, let us try to take a closer look at some of the issues here. First of all, this idea about satisfaction. We should probably go in and kind of define, what do we mean about satisfaction? Because it's not just enough to say, okay, the object we are investigating would be satisfaction. We probably need to understand more about how do we understand satisfaction. Just like we would need to understand what is a supply chain, what is a value chain, what is mapping, etc. So that is the first issue here that we need to take care of. Then how could we collect data? Well, as some of you also mentioned, we could use questionnaires. We could simply create a questionnaire, and we could do interviews. We could do focus group interviews. And focus group interviews is where we collect people and sit down and talk about how satisfied are you? And then we might have the group help us to understand what do they understand about satisfaction. Or we might have defined that satisfaction is something about the temperature in the classrooms satisfactory to certain degrees or whatever it might be. So we might have defined what satisfaction is, and then we are asking them to give their opinion about that. Then we might use something called attitude scales. And an attitude scale is a scale where we are measuring people's attitudes. And an attitude is, for example, that we have a positive attitude towards something, or we have a negative attitude. Now, how can we measure that? Well, we could do some interviews, or we could do some questionnaires where we are asking, how satisfied are you with BCM, and blah, 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 where 1 is very satisfied and 5 is very dissatisfied. That is a way to do it. There are different scales. When we look into it, and we will do that on the 4th semester, we find something called Likert scales and semantic differential scales and stable scales. These are all attitude scales. And you can still calculate an average and a standard deviation, but they will still be subjective. Means people are giving their opinions away. So it's not becoming objective just because we are trying to put numbers on something that is subjective. We simply need to remember that part. And then we have, of course, we could do interviews where we are trying to condense the meaning of what people say. We could have narrative analysis. So there are quite different ways of investigating satisfaction, but often, and you will also find these attitude scales from your midterm or end-term semester measurements of how did you think about this course, for example. Those are attitude scales, and where you express your opinion about what do you think about the teaching, what do you think about the rooms, what do you think about. These are all attitude scales where you express your opinion, and then we use it as an institution to react on things where students indicate this is wrong or this is good, and then we can take action upon it. But it's not the truth, because it's still qualitative. It's still an opinion from a person. So it's not something that can be measured and is a truth in a reality test.